The purpose of this presentation is to show that the conspiratorial view of history, particularly of recent history, is the correct view. That there is a secret and powerful combine at work today. That it constitutes the unseen government of the United States, and that it properly can be identified as the capitalist conspiracy. In 1963, the nation was held spellbound by the testimony of gangster Joe Valachi as he exposed the inside workings of the international crime syndicate known as the Cosa Nostra, or the Mafia. No matter how carefully criminal conspiracies are organized, eventually they're exposed because someone on the inside goes to the authorities and talks. The same is true with political conspiracies. For instance, over the years, there has been a steady stream of defectors from the communist apparatus, and through their testimony, we now have a clear idea of how that conspiracy is organized and operated. But one large piece of the puzzle always has been missing. It's a matter of record that some of the greatest help to world communism often has come from prominent and respectable leaders within the United States. Obviously, these men are not communists. As a matter of fact, most of them are extremely wealthy and are thought of as capitalists, who supposedly would have the most to lose under socialism and communism. And yet the record is disturbingly consistent, and Americans repeatedly have asked why. Why have some of the richest Chile with governments? The key to their same formula would be used: make it look like a government operation, but keep the control in private hands. John D. Rockefeller had purchased the chase hard to bring that system into being. To spin to show and incorporate the president input to the human mind, then no matter how intelligent a person may be, it's entirely possible to program what he will think. And yet, sobering fact that the hidden power structure of international finance has exerted tremendous influence over public opinion in this country through its virtual control of higher education and major segments of mass communications. The human mind is like a computer. No matter how efficient it may be, its reliability is only as great as the information fed into it. If it is possible to control the input of the human mind, then no matter how intelligent a person may be, it's entirely possible to program what he will think. And yes, it's even possible to program people to laugh at the mere mention of the word conspiracy. Such programming, of course, can work in both directions. While one group has been conditioned not to see any conspiracy at work, another group has been led to believe that communists have been behind practically everything, a position easily made to look ridiculous. These well-intentioned anti-communists have been correct in their charge of conspiracy, but incorrect in knowing who to blame.
We've tagged them locusts since this degree of death. Death has only been seen in times of plague. They're subterranean in nature. That's obvious.
The coalition will employ Sarah's entire arsenal of chemical and orbital beam weapons to scorch all locust-infested areas. For those citizens who can't make it to Jacinto, the coalition appreciates your sacrifice. Please forgive us.
Are you afraid?
When Bush Jr. pulled Baker back into public life by naming him his special envoy on Iraq's debt, Baker did not have to cash out of the Carlyle Group or Baker Bots, despite its direct involvement in the war. At first, several commentators pointed out these serious potential conflicts. The New York Times published an editorial calling on Baker to resign his posts at the Carlyle Group and Baker Bots to preserve the integrity of the debt envoy position. Mr. Baker is far too tangled in a matrix of lucrative private business relationships that leave him looking like a potentially interested party in any debt restructuring formula, stated the editorial. It concluded that it wasn't enough for Baker to forego earnings from clients with obvious connections to Iraqi debts. To perform honorably in his new public job, Mr. Baker must give up these two private ones. In keeping with the example set at the top of the administration, Baker simply refused. And Bush backed his decision, leaving Baker in charge of the effort of persuading governments around the world to forgive Iraq's crushing foreign debt. After he had been in the role for nearly a year, I obtained a copy of a confidential document that proves that he was in a far more serious and direct conflict of interest than previously understood. The document was a 65-page business plan submitted by a consortium of companies, including the Carlyle Group, to the government of Kuwait, one of Iraq's main creditors. The consortium offered to use its high-level political connections to collect from Iraq $27 billion in unpaid debts to Kuwait, stemming from Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. In other words, to do exactly the opposite of what Baker was supposed to be doing as envoy, which was to convince governments that Saddam-era debts should be cancelled. The document, titled Proposal to Assist the Government of Kuwait in Protecting and Realizing Claims Against Iraq, was submitted almost 2 months after Baker's appointment. It named James Baker personally 11 times, making it clear that Kuwait would benefit from working with a company that employed the man in charge of erasing Iraq's debts. But there was a price. In exchange for these services, the document said, the government of Kuwait would have to invest $1 billion with the Carlyle Group. It was straight-up influence peddling. Pay Baker's company to get protection from Baker. I showed the document to Kathleen Clark, a law professor at Washington University and a leading expert on government ethics and regulations. And she said Baker was in a classic conflict of interest. Baker is on two sides of this transaction. He is supposed to be representing the interests of the United States, but he is also a senior counselor at Carlyle, and Carlyle wants to get paid to help Kuwait recover its debts from Iraq. After examining the documents, Clark determined that Carlyle and the other companies are exploiting Baker's current position to try to land a deal with Kuwait that would undermine the interests of the U.S. government. The day after my story about Baker was published in The Nation, Carlyle backed out of the consortium, forfeiting its hope of landing the $1 billion. Several months later, Baker cashed out of the Carlyle Group and resigned as general counsel. But the real damage had been done. Baker had performed miserably as envoy, failing to secure the kind of debt forgiveness that Bush had pledged and Iraq required. In 2005 and 2006, Iraq made $2.59 billion in reparation payments for Saddam's war, most to Kuwait. Resources that were desperately needed to meet Iraq's humanitarian crisis and to rebuild the country, especially after U.S. firms pulled out with the aid money squandered and the job left undone. Baker's mandate was to erase 90 to 95% of Iraq's debt. Instead, the debt was merely rescheduled and is still equivalent to 99% of the country's GDP. Other key aspects of Iraq policy were also handed to freelance envoys, whose companies earned record profits from the war. Former Secretary of State George Shultz headed up the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq, a pressure group formed in 2002 at the request of the Bush White House to help it build the case for war in the public mind. Shultz certainly obliged. Since his role was at arm's length from the administration, he was able to whip up hysteria about the imminent danger posed by Saddam, entirely free from any burden of proof or fact. If there is a rattlesnake in the yard, you don't wait for it to strike before you take action in self-defense, he wrote in the Washington Post in September 2002 under the headline, Act Now. The danger is immediate. Saddam Hussein must be removed. Shultz did not disclose to his readers that he was, at the time, a member of the board of directors of Bechtel, where he had served many years earlier as CEO. The company would collect $2.3 billion to reconstruct the country that Shultz was so eager to see destroyed. And then there is Henry Kissinger. the man who kicked off the counter-revolution with his support for Pinochet's coup. In his 2006 book, State of Denial, Bob Woodward revealed that Dick Cheney holds monthly meetings with Kissinger, while Bush meets with Kissinger about half as frequently, making him the most regular and frequent outside advisor to Bush on foreign affairs. Cheney told Woodward, "I probably talked to Henry Kissinger more than I talked to anybody else." But who was Kissinger representing in all those top-level meetings? Like Baker and Schultz, he used to be a Secretary of State, but hasn't held that post for 3 decades. Since 1982, when he started his privately held and secretive company, Kissinger Associates, his job has been to represent a roster of clients that is said to have included everyone from Coca-Cola to Union Carbide to Hunt Oil to the engineering giant Fluor, one of the biggest reconstruction contract winners in Iraq, and even his old partner in the Chilean covert action, ITT. So when he met with Cheney, was he acting as elder statesman or as high-priced lobbyist for his oil and engineering clients? Kissinger gave a strong indication of where his loyalties lay in November 2002 when Bush named him to chair the 9/11 Commission, perhaps the most crucial role any patriot could be called out of retirement to perform. Yet when the families of the victims asked Kissinger to produce a list of his corporate clients, pointing to potential conflicts of interest with the investigation, he refused to cooperate with this basic gesture of public accountability and transparency. Rather than disclose the names of his clients, he stepped down as chair of the commission. The neocons take great pains to project themselves as egghead intellectuals or hawkish realists, driven by ideology and big ideas, not anything so worldly as profit. Even their most committed critics tend to portray the neocons as true believers, motivated exclusively by a belief in the supremacy of American and Israeli power that is so all-consuming they are prepared to sacrifice economic interests in favor of security. This distinction is both artificial and amnesic.